Welcome to the Voice of Wisdom. This is your host, Lorna Halili Parham. Scripture tells us in Proverbs 1 verse 20 that wisdom cries aloud in the streets and lifts her voice in the public square. This is a space where we pause long enough to listen, not to the noise around us, but to the wisdom that comes from God. Here in this podcast, we don't rush for answers. We learn to discern truth. We listen for the voice that leads to life. So wherever you are, whether on the go, in the kitchen, or in the quiet of your day, lean in. Wisdom is speaking. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Wisdom podcast. And this is your host, Lorna Halili Parham. Let me ask you something. What happens when a life that's called to hear God slowly becomes a life that stirs trouble? Like you're meant to listen, you want to listen, but somewhere along the way, reaction starts to take over. And before you realize it, what began as hearing turns into reacting, and reacting turns into disrupting. That's where the second son of Jacob and Leah meets us. His name is Simeon, because his life shows us the real cost of choosing emotion over obedience. But it also shows us something else. There's still hope. No matter how far we've drifted from listening, there's always an invitation from God to come back and hear again. This is episode 3, part 6 of This Is My Tribe series, and I title it From Hearing to Scattering, the Tribe of Simeon. Last episode, we sat with Leah in the naming of her firstborn, Reuben, meaning see a son. And in that moment, you could feel her hope rising. Now my husband will love me. It was raw, it was honest and vulnerable. But if we're paying attention, it was also fragile. Because Leah was placing her expectation for love on something external, something that could never fully heal what she was carrying inside. Now, here's where the story continues. Leah has another son, and instead of her hope being fulfilled, we hear something deeper, something heavier. Genesis 29, verse 33 says, "Because the Lord heard that I am unloved, he gave me this one too." And she names him Simeon. God heard. Can you hear the ache in that? She names her second son Simeon. God heard. But this time, her words shift from hope to hurt. Because the Lord heard that I am loved, he gave me this one too, she said. Did you catch that? To Leah, Simeon wasn't just a name. He represented a belief that maybe this child was an answer, born out of the silent prayer of a hurting wife, a woman longing to be loved. But here's something we can't miss. God never told her, "I heard you. Name him Simeon." That name didn't come as a direct instruction from God. Leah chose that name, which means the naming of her sons is really an expression of what's happening inside of her. With Reuben, she was reaching for love. She said, "Now my husband will love me." With Simeon, she's acknowledging, "I'm still not loved." And she says, "God heard that I am loved." Do you see the progression? At first, she's reaching for love. Now, she's settling into the reality of feeling unloved. Because Simeon isn't just another son in the story. He represents what happens when a prayer feels like it's been heard, but the pain hasn't changed. Every time she calls their names, it becomes a reminder. Now, this can go two ways because there's something powerful about her honesty. She's not hiding her pain, she's bringing it into the open. But at the same time, when your focus stays centered on what you feel, I am unloved, that becomes the lens through which you see everything. And that's a hard place to build from. Imagine if her focus shifted just slightly. Instead of anchoring the name in her condition, I am unloved, what if she anchored it in God's character? He hears. That's a different foundation because one keeps you tied to your pain and the other begins to root you in who God is. And that's where we are stepping in today. Simeon, when God hears, but your situation still feels the same. And if we bring this into our lives today, don't we do the same thing? Sometimes we speak for God based on what we think unanswered prayer means. We say things like, God heard me because something happened, because a door opened, because we received something. And while that may be true, God does hear. We have to be careful not to define His voice based only on outcomes. Because, like Leah, we can interpret a moment and assign meaning to it that is filtered through our pain. Leah said, God heard that I am unloved. But notice, God didn't say you are unloved. That was her interpretation. And how often do we do that? We receive something and then attach a narrative to it. God did this because I am overlooked. God gave me this because I've been rejected. God showed up because I'm lacking. Instead of anchoring in who He is, we interpret through how we feel. So the question becomes, are we declaring what God has truly said? Or are we speaking from what we feel and calling it His voice? Because God may answer, but His answer is never meant to reinforce a lie about your identity. So here we are. Leah names her second son Simeon. God heard. And yes, that's true. God does hear. But if we stay there, we might miss something deeper. Because sometimes we can focus so much on being heard by God that we overlook what that moment is actually inviting us into. And this is where the name Simeon begins to open up in a different way. Simeon isn't just about hearing Leah, it's about what that word heard really means. In the Hebrew, the word behind Simeon is Shama, Shama. And Shama doesn't just mean to hear sound, it means to listen with intention. It means to respond, to obey. So now the focus gently shifts. Not just God heard me, but what does it mean to truly hear? And even more, what does it look like to become someone who listens and responds? Let's talk about that. What's in a name? When Leah names her second son Simeon, She draws from the Hebrew word shama, and this word goes far beyond simply hearing. Shama means to listen with intention, to lean in, and ultimately to respond in obedience. So Simeon doesn't just represent God heard. His name carries the idea of one who hears and responds, one who listens and obeys. Now, here's where this becomes powerful. Leah is focused on being heard, but embedded in the very name Simeon is a deeper invitation, not just about God hearing her, but about the posture of the one who bears the name. Simeon, the listener. Simeon, the responder. Simeon, the one who obeys. And this shifts the perspective for us today, because many of us are asking, is God hearing me? But the name Simeon quietly turns the question back to us. Are we listening? Are we posturing our hearts not just to be heard, but to hear Him? Shema is not passive. It's not just receiving sound. It's receiving truth in a way that moves you to respond. While Leah is expressing her pain, the name she speaks over her son carries a calling beyond her emotion, a call to live as one who listens closely and responds in obedience. And maybe that's the invitation for us today, not just to celebrate that God hears us, but to become people who truly hear Him. Let's bring this into a picture we can all recognize. Think about a typical second-born child. The firstborn has already set the tone. They were the first to be held, the first to be celebrated, the first to receive that undivided attention. Now the second child comes in, and without anyone saying it out loud, there's already a dynamic in place. And what does that second child often do? They start trying to find their place. Some will become extra obedient, well behaved, helpful, quick to listen, almost as if they are thinking, if I do everything right, maybe I will be noticed too. Others go the opposite direction. They become more aggressive, energetic, louder, almost as if they're thinking, if I can't get attention by being good, I'll get it by being seen. Different expressions, but the same root. A desire to be seen, a desire to be valued, a desire to be loved. And when you lay that alongside Simeon's story, it starts to come into focus. Leah already had Reuben, her first attempt at securing love. Now my husband will love me. But when that didn't work, here comes Simeon. And the question almost lingers in the background. What will the second attempt look like? Will it be striving through obedience or striving through intensity? Because sometimes, even obedience, if it's driven by the need for attention, can be rooted in the same place as striving. And that's what makes this so powerful. Simeon's name means one who hears and obeys. But the heart behind it matters. Is it obedience flowing from relationship? Or is it obedience driven by the need to be seen? That's a question that still meets us today. The question becomes, did Simeon's name actually reflect his character? Was he truly one who listens and obeys? Or was that just the meaning assigned to him at birth? It's one thing to carry a name, it's another thing to live it out. Scripture gives us the opportunity to see this unfold. The next time we really see Simeon step into the story in a significant way isn't as a baby, it's as a grown man. And what we're about to read forces us to wrestle with something honestly. Did Simeon become a man who listens and obeys? Or did something else shape him? All right, let's go to that moment. The next time his name rises to the surface, it's not in quiet obedience. It's in a situation that reveals what's really been formed inside of him. Let's go to that moment. Simeon appears in a defining way in Genesis chapter 34, verse 25 through 26. And what we see here is heavy. Dinah, their sister, has been violated. There is real pain, real injustice, real anger in the family. But instead of slowing down and seeking God's direction, two brothers step forward together, Simeon and Levi. Now, this is important to notice. Levi is not just a side detail here. And we will talk more about Levi in the next episode. But today we will see that Levi is Simeon's full brother, born both to Leah and Jacob. And in this moment, their story converges. They are united in response. Simeon and Levi took matters into their own hands and devised a plan against Shechem, who violated their sister Dinah. When the men of the city are vulnerable, Simeon and Levi moved in together. And what follows is devastating. They strike the city, they kill every male, they kill Shechem, they kill Hamor, they rescue Dinah. But it is not justice in the way God defines it. It is vengeance wrapped in strategy. Let's ponder that for a moment. Was God aware of Dinah's pain? Yes. Was injustice present? Yes. Was there a need for righteousness? Yes. But the question is not whether there was pain. The question is, how did Simeon and Levi responded to it? Did they move in Shammah, listening, seeking, obeying? Or did they move in reaction? Here's the next point. When we don't listen, we react. Misdirected zeal is not obedience. Simeon's name carries a beautiful meaning. It's not just any kind of hearing. Shama, Shama, means intelligent hearing. Hearing that is attentive, discerned, aligned with obedience. Simeon's name then means more than just God heard. It also carries the identity of the one who hears intelligently and responds rightly. Levi's name carries its own identity. It means joined or attached. And here in this story, we see them joined together, but not in worship, not in obedience, not in alignment with God. They are united in retaliation. And this is where the tension becomes deeply personal for us. You can be justified in your pain and still be wrong in your response. Simeon wasn't wrong to feel anger. Levi wasn't wrong to feel protective, but neither of them paused to listen. There was no Shama. No waiting, no seeking God's instruction. And when there's no listening, reaction takes over. And reaction always escalates faster than wisdom can guide. What began as grief turned into a massacre. And here's the sobering truth: wounded people can agree on action, but that does not make the action obedient. They were united, but not submitted to God's plan. And sometimes that's the most dangerous kind of unity. After Simeon and Levi carry out this violent response, Jacob finally speaks. In Genesis chapter 34, verse 30, Jacob says to them, "You have brought trouble on me, not just pain, not just disagreement, but trouble." And that word is important. Jacob isn't affirming their action as justice. He is naming the consequence of their action. What Simeon and Levi did may have felt justified in that moment, but it created fallout that was far bigger than their intention. And this is where we begin to see the danger of what we could call not intelligent hearing. They heard the situation, but they didn't truly listen in a way that led to obedience. They responded, but not from alignment. They acted, but not from discernment. And when hearing is disconnected from obedience, reaction often becomes aggressive, impulsive, and emotionally driven. And Jacob's words expose the cost. You have brought trouble on me. In other words, this didn't just stay personal, this expanded. This affected legacy. This created a ripple effects. And it's sobering because what they thought was defense ended up becoming destruction. So now the question shifts for us as we move forward. What happens when hearing is emotional but not surrendered? What happens when response is fast but not filtered through God? Unchecked reaction doesn't just solve problems, it multiplies them. And when hearing is not shaped by obedience, reaction takes over and it escalates quickly. What began as personal pain becomes widespread destruction. Let's pause and sit with this for a moment. Wounded people can move fast together, but speed does not equal righteousness. Let's pause and reflect on these questions. Am I practicing Shema, intelligent hearing, or am I reacting from emotion? Do I slow down enough to hear and discern God's voice before I respond? Where have I mistaken urgency for obedience? Am I letting pain interpret my decisions more than God's truth? And does my response reflect listening or impulsive agreement with my emotions? This is where the story begins to widen because Simeon didn't develop isolation. He was formed in a household already marked by tension, rivalry, and unresolved pain. Simeon watched his older brother bring trouble into the family by defiling his father's bed. Now Simeon follows a similar pattern, only this time the trouble expands outward. And that leads us into the next sobering truth. In Genesis chapter 34, verse 30, Jacob said, "You have brought trouble on me, not just consequences, but ripple effects." When Reuben acted impulsively, it destabilized the home. When Simeon and Levi acted reactively, it destabilized the entire city. One generation of unprocessed response can shape the next generation's patterns. Simeon, whose name carries intelligent hearing, is now seen through the lens of a pattern he has observed and repeated. Simeon, watching his older brother Reuben, brought trouble into their home, defiling the father's bed. Now Simeon followed suit, not in the same act, but in the same pattern of impulsive, unfiltered response. And Jacob names the consequence clearly: you brought trouble. When hearing is not intelligent, when it is not surrendered, it doesn't just stay internal, it multiplies. Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me." The word trouble in Hebrew is akar, A-K-A-R. It carries a vivid picture. It literally means to roil water, to stir something until it becomes cloudy, muddy, and unsettled, almost like taking a still body of water and disturbing everything at the bottom so that what was once clear becomes unclear. In fact, Merriam-Webster defines roil as to make turbid by stirring up the sediment or dregs, to disturb, to disorder. Jacob is not just saying, "You caused me inconvenience." He is saying, "You stirred things up. You disturbed what was once stable. You made what was clear unclear." And this becomes even more striking when we connect it to Jacob's earlier words over Reuben in Genesis 49, verse 4. To Reuben, he pronounced unstable as water. So now we see a pattern forming in the family. Reuben is described as unstable water, water that cannot hold shape. It cannot stay steady, it's easily shifting. And now Simeon and Levi are prescribed as those who roil water. They don't just lack stability, they disturb stability. Reuben is unstable water. Simeon and Levi are stirred water. One reflects internal instability, the other produces external disruption. One cannot hold himself steady, the other cannot keep situations steady. And together, it paints a sobering picture of what happens when Shama, intelligent hearing, is not governing response. Because when we are not listening well, you don't just drift internally, you begin to disturb everything around you. And this is where Simeon's story becomes deeply personal for us. Jacob's words are not only a correction, they are a revelation. You brought trouble. You stirred the water. You disrupted what was meant to remain steady. Here's where this stops being just an ancient family story and starts becoming a mirror of focus. Jacob's words, "You have brought trouble," aren't just about Simeon and Levi. They expose a pattern we still wrestle with today. The Hebrew word akar, A-K-A-R, paints a picture of being stirred, roiled, until what was once clear becomes clouded and unsettled. If we're honest, we know what that looks like in real life. Peace in a relationship, then one conversation stirs it up. Clarity in a situation, then one reaction muddies everything. Stability in a room, then one uncontrolled response shifts the entire atmosphere. So the question becomes personal. Are we stirring up peace or are we stirring up trouble? Are we people who settle the waters or are we people who disturb them? Sometimes the issue isn't that the situation was already chaotic. Sometimes it's that our response made it worse. When we don't pause, when we don't listen deeply, when we don't practice Shema, we can end up reacting in ways that disturb what God was trying to keep steady. And that's sobering because not every emotional response is righteous. Not every strong reaction is wise. Not every justified feeling produces peace. Sometimes it just stirs the water. Let's reflect on these questions. Am I bringing peace into situations or am I stirring them up? When I speak or react, does the atmosphere around me become clearer or more clouded? Where in my life am I quick to stir the water instead of waiting for clarity? Do my emotions lead me into calm responses or disruptive reactions? If someone described my presence as water, would it be still and steady or turbulent and unsettled? Am I practicing Shama, intelligent hearing, or am I reacting in ways that disturb what God is trying to stabilize? When we talk about stirring the water, disrupting peace, or creating trouble, the book of Proverbs actually speaks very directly to this. Proverbs describes the weight of someone who cannot control their words or emotions. For example, Proverbs 29, verse 11 says, "A fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back." In other words, unfiltered reaction doesn't produce wisdom, it produces disturbance. Then we read in Proverbs 15, verse 1 reminds us, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." That word stirs carried the same idea we've been talking about: agitation, disruption, escalation. Not resolution, but escalation. Again, in Proverbs chapter 17, verse 14, it says, "Starting a quarrel is like breaching a dam. So drop the matter before a dispute breaks out." That's a powerful imagery because once the water breaks through, once the conflict is released without restraint, it becomes harder to contain the damage. Finally, in Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16 through 19, lists the things that the Lord hates, including one who sows discord among brothers. Not just conflict, but sowing it, planting it, spreading it, and stirring it. So when we bring this back to Simeon and Levi and Jacob's words about trouble, we begin to see a consistent biblical warning. Uncontrolled reaction doesn't just stay personal, it disrupts peace. It stirs what God intended to remain steady. And when we bring it all the way back to Simeon, this is what we see: a man whose very name carried the call to listen intelligently and obey, yet in the moment of pain, he moved without listening. Instead of Shama, there was reaction. Instead of obedience, there was escalation. And Jacob's words still echo over the response: "You have brought trouble." When hearing is disconnected from surrender, Even justified emotion can stir what God intended to keep at peace. Simeon's action reminds us that unfiltered response doesn't just resolve pain, it multiplies, disturbs it, and spreads it further than we ever intended. And that leads us forward. The next time Simeon's name appears in Scripture, we begin to see something else unfold in this story. Not just what he did in one moment, but what became of him over time. In Genesis chapter 42, we read that there's famine in the land, severe enough that Jacob sends his sons to Egypt to buy grain because their survival depends on it. And unbeknownst to them, the man they're standing before is Joseph, their brother, whom they sold years earlier. But Joseph recognizes them. And in that encounter, something happens that shifts the atmosphere. Genesis chapter 42 tells us that Joseph detains them, and specifically, he takes Simeon from among them and has him bound before their eyes. Now, pause there for a minute because those words carry weight. The word took comes from the Hebrew word lakach, Laqach. It means to receive, to take, but also to seize, acquire, bring, or even to take into possession. It's not a casual taking, it is a decisive action. Simeon is removed, taken out of the group, and held. And then we're told he is bound. The Hebrew word for bound is asar, A-S-A-R, means to bind, imprison, to tie, restrain, to yoke, or to hitch. So Simeon is not just held, he is restrained, limited, confined, and he is watching it happen before their eyes. Now imagine that moment. The same hands that took up weapons in Shechem are now being taken. The same brother who once participated in binding an agreement with Shechem, remember Genesis 34? There was a binding covenant made through deception and violence, is now one physically bound. And it almost echoes Shechem and shackles. There is a painful irony here because Simeon once helped orchestrate a binding that led to destruction, and now he experiences what it feels like to be bound. So the question naturally rises, what was going on in Simeon's mind in that moment? Was he remembering the city of Shechem? Was he remembering Levi standing beside him? Was he remembering Jacob's words, "You have brought trouble"? Was this Simeon's first time he felt what it meant to lose control, to be restrained, to have no power over what happens next? Sometimes life doesn't just confront our actions, it confronts our memory. And Simeon is now in a position where he is no longer the one stirring the water. He is the one sitting in it. He is now the one being bound. And I wonder what that moment felt like for him. Because restraint has a way of doing something that chaos never does. It forces reflection. Sometimes God does not immediately punish. Sometimes He allows restraint, not to destroy you, but to reveal you. Because when movement is taken away, noise gets quiet. And when noise gets quiet, truth starts to surface. Simeon is no longer the one acting. He is the one being acted upon. No control, no strategy, No force, no reaction, just stillness. And in that stillness, something has to confront him. Maybe he remembers Shechem, the city where he once moved with Levi in violent agreement. Maybe he remembers the binding agreement they made there, words that looked strategic but led to destruction. And now the irony is impossible to ignore. Shechem and shackles, the one who bound others, is now bound. And here is the emotional weight of it. God is not just correcting Simeon's behavior, he is confronting Simeon's patterns. Because sometimes God doesn't speak first through explanation, he speaks through limitation. He allows restraint to become revelation, revelation of consequences, revelation of patterns, revelation of what uncontrolled response produces over time. And here is the grace hidden in it. Simeon is still alive, still seen, still included in the story. He is bound, but not abandoned. Because even restraint is not rejection, it is invitation, an invitation to see differently, to hear differently, to finally return to Shema, intelligent hearing that leads to obedience. So here's the question that leaves us with. What if the bound seasons in our lives are not just punishment, but God interrupting our motion so He can interrupt our patterns? What if restraint is not the absence of God's voice, but the place where His voice becomes possible to ignore? Because sometimes God doesn't just speak in freedom, sometimes He speaks in restraint. And what He is after is revelation. And this is where the scriptures speak so clearly into Simeon's moment and ours. Proverbs chapter 17, verse 27 says, "The one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even tempered." Wisdom is not rushed reaction, it is restrained response. And sometimes restraint itself becomes the classroom of wisdom. Proverbs chapter 29, verse 20 says, "Do you see someone who speaks in haste? There is more hope for a fool than for them." Hasty response blinds us, but restraint creates space to see clearly. And then we hear the invitation of God Himself in Psalm 46, verse 10. "Be still and know that I am God." Stillness is not inactivity, it is recognition. It is the place where noise quiets enough for truth to rise. Even conviction often comes not in chaos, but in stillness. There are moments where what feels like limitation is actually God's restraining mercy, not to silence us forever, but to stop us long enough to hear rightly again. Because sometimes the most loving thing God can do is interrupt our movement so He can interrupt our pattern. Here's the question this moment leaves us with. What if the places where we feel restricted are actually the places where God is restoring our ability to listen? What if restraint is not rejection, but divine interruption for deeper revelation? Because sometimes God doesn't just speak in movement, God speaks in stillness. And stillness is where intelligent hearing begins. Okay, let's transition to the final point. When patterns become prophetic consequences. Now we come to the final layer of Simeon's story, Jacob's prophetic proclamation in Genesis chapter 49, verse 7. Jacob says, "Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." This is where we have to slow down and handle this carefully. Jacob